So as you see, this says the roots of anti-Blackness and the African presence in Mesoamerica. You notice it does not say the roots of anti-Blackness in Mesoamerica. And the reason why this is the case, because anti-Blackness far precedes anything that we're talking about in terms of slavery and those types of things. This is a picture of the African warrior Yanga, which we will talk about a little bit more, and an Afro-Mexican sister. Okay, next slide. The roots of anti-Blackness lie in the prehistoric confrontations between hunter-gatherers versus the forerunners of the great civilizations. This began 10 to 12,000 years ago, when the first cities were built. It pitted the burgeoning fixed armies of large city-states against smaller groups of autonomous, mainly nomadic people. This is a photograph of the Göbekli Tepe temple or city in Turkey, which is about 12,000 years old right now. It's supposed to be the oldest archaeological ruin of a city. And the thing I want to mention before we go any further is that those of us who are people of color and everyone, we hearken back to our great civilizations, because as we were growing up, Greek and Roman civilizations were put as the pinnacle of civilization. So when we, of course, discover that ancient Egypt was an African civilization, ancient Nubia, then there was Mesopotamia, and then there's the Chinese civilization in the Yangtze River. And then you have the New World civilizations of the Aztec and Maya, Olmec, and Inca. We tend to, of course, and rightfully so, take pride in these civilizations. The thing I want to remind us, though, is that these large nation states were, in effect, the beginning of oppression of the neighboring hunter-gathering, what we now call indigenous people. You can't build a great civilization with huge temples and various artifacts without oppression. People had to devote their entire lives to just doing this. So for me, they do not necessarily represent the highest forms of our culture. For me, they are representative of our culture, but the highest forms of our culture could actually still be in the earliest remnants of hunter-gatherers. And I give the example of the Aka pygmies, for instance. These are small people in the bush in the Congo, and they're considered the most primitive people. Yet, they're one of the most egalitarian societies on earth. There's virtually no domestic violence or child abuse. If a man beats one of their children, the woman can have that as a grounds for divorce. They share everything. They have one of the most egalitarian societies on earth. So we have to shift our thinking in terms of this linear idea that we have gone from this primitive indigenous person to these civilized indigenous people, when really it's a spiral or a circle. Next slide, please. I put this in here just because sometimes as Homo sapiens, we are a bit arrogant, and we don't think we are in the same category, say, as the Neanderthals or the Denisovians. Homo as a species comprises 15 subspecies, and there's over a 2 million year history. And the only point I want to make is that Homo sapiens have been around only 200,000 to 300,000 years. You have other species, the Neanderthal and Homo erectus in particular, they both lived 600,000 years. So before we as Homo sapiens pump our chest too much, we want to give them a little props, because who knows, we may not be here 500,000 to 600,000 years. So I still say these are our cousins. We don't want to hate on them, as the young people say. Next slide, please. So this sets the stage for the first bias, basically, kind of a binary or a dialectic between city-states who are urban, who have agriculture, they have fixed armies, they levy taxes or fines and fees. There's hierarchy. Power is concentrated more at the top. They're often more patriarchal. There's a beginning sense of seeing nature as something to be conquered. This is versus a more nomadic, hunter-gatherer, sporadic small-scale agriculture, no fixed army, but they may have a warrior class, no taxes or levies, but may give out of respect and need, no or less hierarchy, power distributed more horizontally, less patriarchal, often matrilineal, going through the mother, and the worldview is being more at one with nature. And while both of these dichotomies are maybe materialistic, I mean, I would say the civilizations are the first beginnings of what we now would call materialism. Indigenous and hunter-gatherers are materialistic as well because they have to survive. The difference is that everything that they do on a material level is infused with something sacred, something spiritual. There's a certain connectedness that they feel. And in some respects, we made a break with that. And I think to some extent, we're still suffering from it today. Next slide, please. So progressively, indigenous hunter-gatherers lost ground, but they're not gone. There's over 400 million people today that still exist in various degrees of their traditional lifestyle. I highlight this book here by John Bodley because it's gone through 5 editions, Victims of Progress. And it's one of the few books early on that looked at history from the long lens of indigenous people. And it is from his teachings that the 10 to 12,000 year figure has been looked at. Today, many of the indigenous tribes are not hunter-gatherers. They coexist to various degrees alongside technological societies. Next slide, please. So out of this fundamental battle, at least from my perspective, came the seeds then for first anti-indigenousness, sexism, and anti-environmentalism. With these patriarchal societies concentrating power, women began to lose more power. The more ancient the society and the more, the further back you go, or the more so-called primitive the society is, the more power women have. In hunter-gatherer societies, the women are basically responsible for providing much of the food. They gather most of the food. The hunting part is like 10%. They ate very little meat, ate it when necessary. I highlight this book here, Against the Grain by James Scott, because he looks at the long view of history and basically charts how the first viral diseases and infections began to come because we were in close proximity to one another. He compares the weakness of a domesticated animal versus a wild animal, and basically puts forth the idea that as modern humans, we're basically domesticated and in some respects weaker. Now, we don't want to romanticize antiquity in the sense that people did not live a long time. They had parasites. They had a lot to deal with. So we're not saying it was just perfect. But in some respects, we have thrown the baby out with the bathwater, as they say, that we haven't preserved the best of some of the things that we could have. Next slide, please. So anti-indigenousness plus the Judeo-Christian Islamic bias against the children of Ham or Hamites, who according to the Bible gave rise to the Negroid races being cursed. Now, this is a complex issue, but there is this justification that has been used at different times around the so-called curse of Ham. Basically, Noah got drunk, and Ham, out of his three sons, looked at Noah being naked, and supposedly based on that, the children of Ham, particularly Canaan and or Cush, were cursed, and they were basically bound to servitude. And at different times, particularly in American slavery and during the slave trade and during the Islamic era, they accepted some of this. This gave rise and justification then to enslave African people on the premise that that was what we were meant to do, and that was our special calling or mission in life. There's a phrase within some Jewish texts about he was smitten by the skin, meaning he was smitten by given dark skin. So then you have the ingredient of the profit motive of colonization and capitalism was added, which then enhanced the previous exhibitions of materialism, greed, power, and control. This found a perfect culmination. Anti-Indigenousness, slavery, serfdom, indentured servitude, capitalism, racism, white supremacy, anti-environmentalism, and anti-Blackness in some respects still have these ancient roots. Next slide, please. This is my attempt at doing a kind of a chart, which didn't come out quite the way I wanted it to, but it looks at early city-states or civilization versus hunter-gatherers or slash and burn agriculture. And from my perspective, three main things came out of that clash. An anti-indigenousness, meaning there was a sense of superiority over hunter-gatherers or nomadic people. There's a projection of them all of a sudden now being primitive or savage. And with that then is the subjugation of women, which now is called sexism. Back then it was just called a natural phenomenon. And then you have this idea that begins to slowly arise that humans are the masters of the planet and the masters of this earth, and that we're destined to change it at our will. Now, indigenous people use technology as well. So we don't want to say that indigenous people aren't scientific, because scientific thinking and technology all come out of these early indigenous societies. But the idea that we can conquer nature or defeat nature or control nature is to some extent part of the so-called civilized thinking, rather than the idea of melding with nature, harmonizing with nature, and accepting the rhythms of nature as being your rhythms, and that you are an integral part of it, not separate. So then you have this kind of a trajectory where the materialism that comes out of these ancient civilizations is then added to this bias in the Judeo-Christian Islamic context. You add the profit motive of capitalism. Capitalism in certain forms had been around even since the Middle Ages. You had the early merchants trading constantly, but it was greatly increased with the idea that gold could be discovered first in West Africa, and then the spices in the Spice Islands or in Indonesia and those places far east. These began to be coveted and prized in Europe and going for high prices. So that launched the first explorers, particularly in 1444, where the first Portuguese went to West Africa. And they went to get gold, but they didn't find gold, but they came back with people. And they sold those Africans and realized that there was a great deal of profit in that. So that then kind of started the slave trade, and the colonialism went right along with it. Next slide, please. So then we get to the transatlantic slave trade. And as you see these arrows, they are going in a lot of different directions, mostly from West Africa to the west, and then from West and Central Africa north, earlier in the Islamic slave trade. As you see, a great bulk of African slaves went to, and there's a controversy right now. We're beginning to use the word enslaved as opposed to slave, because enslaved kind of denotes that this is something that was done to them, not their natural state. Sometimes I slipped, so forgive me for that. But you see these arrows going, the large percentage going to Brazil, but then a certain amount going to the Caribbean, and then you see a tiny little thread going all the way to Veracruz, what is now Veracruz, Mexico. Next slide, please. So as we know, Christopher Columbus sailed to the New World in 1492, and of course he landed in Hispaniola and in Cuba first. And that started the negative interaction between Spanish, and the Caribe and the Tarawak Indians. But as far as Mexico is concerned, in 1519, Hernando Cortez arrives in Mexico. He is treated with hospitality by the native people. He immediately begins pitting groups of native people against each other. He undertakes several expeditions that eventually helped destroy the Aztec Empire. A native woman renamed Donna Marina bore him his first child. Now, obviously, you could do a whole lecture just on this slide because it sets the stage for a number of things. Of course, these expeditions were often warring parties and trying to find gold primarily. At first, they weren't trying to necessarily conquer Mexico or even destroy its people. As they did not find gold, then they realized that there were other riches to be had in terms of people, farming, trading, so forth. The fact that he takes a bride of a native woman sets the stage too for the miscegenation and mixture that will follow that eventually forms the Mexican people, or at least two elements of it. It is not known whether or not this child was free or not. The first native peoples that were there, at this point, it was probably free because the Indian lady was not a slave. That would come a little bit later. Next slide, please. This is a picture of an African man named Juan Garrido. A free African man is with Cortez. He participates in several expeditions. This sets up a first impression and an obvious contradiction. He is with the white man and essentially with someone who will soon become the enemy. He's considered to be the first person to farm wheat in Mexico. So I put this in here because you can imagine how native people were probably looking at him. They were probably perplexed. What is his position? Whose side is he on? He's dressed in Spanish clothes, but he obviously does not look like a Spaniard. And then there's what's going on in his mind. How does he identify himself? Does he think he's a Spaniard? Or does he feel like he's an African? Does he identify with the other brown-skinned people that he sees? And so this kind of sets up what you could imagine a first degree of distrust of Africans if this is the first one that they saw. Next slide, please. In the first 60 years, many African slaves were shipped to Mexico via the horrific Middle Passage. They were mostly male and married mostly Indian women. Their children would be born free because technically the Indian mother was free. On the right here, you have the depiction of a slave ship. All of those little tight figures there are bodies. And as you see, they're packed like sardines. And so just imagine for a second, you're in your village in West Africa. A raiding party of other Africans, not Europeans, other Africans come and raid your village. They capture you. They march you 200 to 300 to 400 miles to the coast. During that time you're marching, you get sick because you pass through areas that have illnesses that you had never been exposed to. Africa, as a humid, hot place, has all kinds of illnesses and infectious diseases, even then. So by the time you get to the coast, you're already weakened. Then you're put into this room on the left here. This was called the cell. And that little opening, that door, that's called the door of no return. It led to a plank that led right onto a slave ship in which they were put on, never to be seen again. And so I go through this thing where there's certain postures of captivity. First, you had to have the posture of walking bent over. Then there's the posture of kneeling, huddled in the cell. Then there's the posture of laying flat on your back for hours at a time at night, with defecation and feces and urine all mixed in on everybody. The stench would have been horrible. And then you are then shipped across this country, across the ocean. These postures, and these in African-American groups, we go through these because these postures are still within us. And sometimes it's helpful to go through experiencing these various postures of captivity to a more liberated posture to let your body experience what it means to be free. Oftentimes we liberate our minds, but we haven't focused on our somatic impulses. Next slide, please. So the Spanish preferred lighter complexions, mainly because they were a minority and they felt giving certain privileges to fair-skinned children would build allegiance to them rather than the dark-skinned masses. Social status was governed by skin color, with white at the top, black at the bottom. And as you see this chart here, in Latin America, and particularly Mexico, the classifications and the gradations of different types of mixture was very precise. This is 12. I've seen charts of 16 different kinds, meaning if you mix this and that, you get that. And if you mix that and that, you get this. And you have all these kind of categories. Morosco, of course, is some kind of Moreno brown. And then you have you see China, or Chino, that shows up a great deal. Later, we would talk about how, in many respects, Mexican people are a composition of European, Native, and African. But we also have to understand that there was, in some cases, a fourth element. Filipinos were brought to Mexico in large numbers for quite a number of years, and they became just called Chino. Anybody from Asia were called Chino. But most of the Chino people were Filipinos. In fact, Mexico for a brief period was called New Philippines because Spain governed both the Philippines and Mexico. Next slide, please. Spain had to constantly replenish its enslaved Africans because many of the offspring were free. Unlike US, they had to have a little, in the United States, the only way a mixed child could be free is if the mother was white. Whatever your mother was determined your color and your status. Because there were very few African women in the New World, most of the children that were mixed were often deemed free. And there's a Lightningization process that began. Next slide, please. Now, obviously, Native American people were the first slaves in the New World. Their numbers, though, began decreased by genocidal war and disease. And if there's any advantage Native Americans might have had over their African brothers and sisters, is that when they ran away, they sometimes could run away. And when they ran away to their homeland, a familiar place where they knew. When Africans ran away, they didn't know where they were going. And often it worked out, sometimes it didn't. Spain then turned increasingly toward Africa. Bartolomé de las Casas argued for better treatment of native people, of course, after killing many. and urged the increased importation of Africans in the late 1600s. Next slide, please. So by 1600, so-called Indian slavery was ruled illegal in New Spain. Now this is complex because whereby native people were no longer enslaved, the genocidal campaign and the diseases still went on. So on one level, you had the benefit of not being enslaved per se, but then you had the other not so good benefit of being hunted down and wanted for their land. So we're not trying to say that Africans or native people had one better than the other. It was a very complex shared legacy and at times some differences. From then on, only Africans were enslaved. Peak period was between 1580 to 1640. In 60 years alone, they imported over 1,000 Africans a year. Most of them came through Veracruz. From there, they went to Mexico City. Next slide, please. There they were sold at will, stripped of their names, language, and culture, denied religion. This is a picture of, say, an auction block. And it's a really benevolent one because oftentimes they may not have had clothes on and they would be fondled and handled almost like you would handle a horse. People would immediately go into your mouth and have you open your mouth. They would explore any and all orifices within the body. They would grab men by their testicles and genitals. They were totally humiliated in this way. Next slide, please. There were few African women in the New World. The few that were there were often taken as concubines by wealthy white men. Africans were trying to improve their children's status. They could not attend school or many churches or travel, often forbidden to marry. So in a case like this, where the woman is a brown woman and the man, more than likely that child, as a fairer child, would be considered more valuable or more and a representative of the colonial empire. And so African women sometimes would go into these relationships, obviously, because they think it would better their children's life. Next slide, please. The punishment for breaking those rules, though, was the severing of a hand, foot, or ear, hot wax or fat poured on skin, castration. They rarely killed them, though, outright because they were considered valuable property. So rather than having a genocidal campaign, like even in the United States, slaves weren't killed before 1863. In fact, lynching began after Reconstruction. The greatest and worst period for lynching was between 1880 and 1920 or 30, when you had spectacle lynchings in the United States, where white people would go like they were going to a circus or a ball game, and you had children there, and you had these photographs where people are smiling. You have this branding process here. There's hideous comments, statements in slave literature of the kind of torture, though, that people had to go through. Now, we talk about trauma today, and the trauma that we talk about is somebody being scolded or experiencing racism or being talked to a certain way. Imagine the trauma that you'll have and your body has after you've been tortured or treated in this way. That's a whole nother degree of trauma. Next slide, please. By the mid-1600s, over 150,000 Africans were in New Spain. They outnumbered whites 2 to 1. Natives outnumbered both 30 to 1. Next slide, please. There were many slave revolts. If the Africans were captured, they were beheaded and paraded through towns to invoke fear. Many escaped to the countryside and formed free colonies called palenques. In Jamaica, they were called maroons. And there were many famous ones. In Mexico, next slide, please. The most famous revolt in Mexico was led by a brother named Iñanga Yanga, who repelled Spanish attacks and forced Spain to sign a treaty in 1612. In the mid-1700s, other slaves escaped and organized settlements on the Pacific coast. It's called the Costa Chica today. Next slide, please. By the early 1700s, the pure African population began to decline due to disease and decreased importation. Yellow fever, syphilis, and TB were the main killers. Exposure to smallpox somewhat gave Africans immunity because they'd been interacting with Europeans for over 300 years. But today we talk about social distancing and shelter in place. Imagine getting an infectious disease during this time and you are an enslaved person. You had no space, particularly if you were on a boat. Next slide, please. So Spanish slavery gradually evolved to where they came to apply their what is called siete partidas, which governed slaves in the old world, and they started applying it to Africans in the new world. And these slave codes were basically old codes that they used with regards to Arabs, Jews, Gypsies, and other people in their own colonies. And it basically was, what you would say, the last one. The Partidas envisioned the slave as a persona and not as a mere property. The master was regarded as having duties towards his slaves as well as rights over them. So we don't want to say there's some kind of gradation in slavery. Slavery is slavery. However, it has been demonstrated that the Spanish and Portuguese version of slavery was much different and to some degrees less physically brutal than the American version employed by the French, British, and of course the Germans in Germany. Next slide, please. So by the end of the 1700s, the races had become mixed, such that talk of people being mestizo arose. Next slide. In 1810, a Jesuit priest, Father Hidalgo, assisted by a group of Afro-Mexicans called Batallon de los Morenos, led the fight for Mexico's independence. Next slide, please. An early leader was Vicente Guerrero, known as El Negro Guerrero, who rallied non-whites against the Spanish. He became Mexico's second president. And as you see, nowadays he would be called a light-skinned brother. And there are a number of people in Mexico today who fit his description, who still and may not necessarily put on the census form that they are African, but they clearly have some African mixture. Next slide, please. There was a concerted effort then to create a Mexican people and downplay ethnicities. And in some respects, this was an advance. Mexico was really far ahead of its time to some extent in this regard. Yet, the previous anti-Indigenousness and racism gave rise to this preference of lighter skin. Racial discrimination was technically eliminated, yet the mejorar la raza concept, or improve the race idea, resulted in an elite that is fairer skinned than the general population. And that goes for today. Next slide, please. So they developed a movement beginning rumbling in the 1890s and finding full fruition in the early part of the 20th century. And the effort led largely by this particular scholar. His name is Gonzalo Aguirre Beltran. And he wrote this book, Negro Population in Mexico, 1519 to 1810. And it pushed the concept of nuestra tercera raíz, our third root. He was one of the main proponents in really pushing for Mexican people to not just think that the mestizo meant a mixture of Spanish and Native American, but also included African people. And I would say even to a certain extent now, to some extent, even Filipino people. Next slide, please. Today it is estimated that an average Mexican person will have anywhere between 4 and 26% African ancestry. And this is not including the 1.5 million or more who self-identify as Afro-Mexican. say for instance, the sister up at the top and the brother at the far right corner, they are considered mestizos, even though they may, given their appearance, may have some degree of African blood. Whereas this brother and the two sisters, they are clearly African Mexicans and who self-identify as African and live in the Costa Chica coast. Next slide, please. Today, large numbers of people with African admixture live in Veracruz, Coahuila, Zacatecas, Sinaloa, Southern Yucatan, Quintana Roo. In Coahuila, many are mixed with Seminole Indian and African slave descendants who had come from Florida. In northern Mexico also, you have a good number of Africans who went south. The Underground Railroad went north and south. So you have whole communities in northern Mexico of just little couple black towns of just black people who were descendants from here. And then we're not talking about, too, the black people that joined the Mexican Revolution. So we end by saying the evolution out of identity politics. The ideas espoused by Jimmy and Grace Lee Boggs and others encourages us to transcend our own identity politics by combating the racism, anti-Blackness, anti-Indigenousness, and sexism first within ourselves. For real change in America, each progressive group must find, oh, I'm sorry, next slide, Abraham. I'm sorry. This is Grace Lee Boggs, and her book, The Next American Revolution, is a brilliant piece because it's outlining the need for a major transformation. But it's not talking about a violent revolution. It's not talking about guerrilla warfare. It's not talking about revolutions like the ones they chronicle in their book, Revolution and Evolution, where they critique the inadequacies of many of the 20th century revolutions. Grace's perspective is that we have to be grounded in our culture, respect who we are, have a certain degree of independence and autonomy in our practicing of our culture, yet transcend our culture politically and not espouse what we call identity politics. No one group of people in America can be free by itself. In fact, people of color by ourselves can't be free. We need a consortium and a wide alliance of people that comprise working class whites, poor whites if possible, people of color, anyone progressive that wants to change this world. And the idea is to live the alternative, basically to create situations within our communities that almost makes the state wither away. If we provide some of the things that the state provides, the state then won't have to provide them. So that's the idea. And that is the overall gist and purpose of me addressing the question of anti-Blackness. The next slide, please. I just want to show you that this is a selected bibliography. It's very limited. But these are some of the books that I got this from, and if you want to take a picture of this, it's possible. I don't expect or ask anyone to accept anything that I say on face value. Look it up for yourself. Check my references scrupulously because I check others. This is another page of references. I do have a book on here by Maestro Jerry Teo and one of my own books as well. I have to push our work because sometimes, you know how it is, familiarity loves contempt. You can be around people who are doing significant things and not appreciate them. So I always try to give appreciation to Maestro's work. And I benefited from it greatly because even though I didn't quote it and use it, particularly in this piece, the idea that he advances on people being sacred and preserving sacred traditions really has infused a lot of my thinking on this in a different, more holistic way. Okay, and last slide, please. That's me there. I have several other affiliations, as you know, Brotherhood of Elders Network, as well as the Healing Generations Institute. But I didn't put those on here because I espouse some politics here that I don't know if those two groups necessarily would even agree with, but I don't want them to be painted with that same brush. I proudly am a part of both of those, as well as affiliated with the National Compadres Network as well. And I'm proud of those affiliations. But the content of this, I'm solely responsible for. So if you have some problems with it, it's totally on me. With that, I will end. If there's any questions or anything